Our focus for today is on rethinking time and space. Students learn deeply when we use technology to expand our notion of when and where learning happens. At the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, we as educators spent a considerable amount of time upskilling and learning new approaches to teaching and learning that integrated online tools. How might we continue to leverage the skill set to deepen engagement and better meet our students where they are? In a moment, we'll turn to our panelists for their thoughts and reflections. In our chat today, we have Deep Sidhu from GOA, and she will again be looking at the chat, answering questions as they come up, fielding questions, and dropping links as needed. So just keep an eye out for her name in our chat. And then our AMA panelists today, we are lucky to have Dr. Catlin Tucker from catlintucker.com, Bonnie Latham from GOA, and Kareem Farah from Modern Classrooms.
All right, well, thank you for having me. I'm Catlin Tucker, and I spent 16 years in an English language arts classroom. I've been a blended learning coach. I have written, I think, 8 books, 2 coming out this year. My area of expertise is blended and online learning, and I got my doctorate in that subject area as well. So this is definitely reimagining all kinds of learning and teaching, or kind of where I spend my time and I'm very passionate about. So I'm excited to be part of this conversation.
Thank you so much. Kareem.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks for joining, everyone, and thanks for having me. My name is Kareem Farah. I'm the co-founder and CEO of the Modern Classrooms Project. We're a nonprofit that essentially empowers and supports educators in rethinking classroom instruction to kind of move away from the one-size-fits-all approach and to leverage technology to build student-centered, self-paced, mastery-based learning environment. So I was a teacher for years. First in Hawaii. I see a number of folks in the chat who are in Hawaii, which I love, and then spent the remainder of my teaching career in DC, and then left the classroom to lead the organization full time. We built this approach in our classrooms in many ways as a version of what tons of incredible and innovative educators have been doing for years. And now we train teachers in as many ways as we can, largely through our free course and then through school and district partnerships. So I'm extremely excited to be here and excited to discuss these important questions.
This is so fun to see so many familiar faces. I am Bonnie Latham. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. I am in Seattle, Washington, and I am GOA's Director of Professional Learning. I've worked at GOA for 5 years. Prior to working for GOA, I was also a classroom teacher in the Highline School District, just south of Seattle, for many years at a big picture learning school. And at GOA, we design learning experiences that shift educator practice, and our areas of expertise include high quality online learning and competency-based learning. And so as we think about the design of online learning spaces and competency-based learning spaces, a thread through both of these is rethinking time and space. So really excited to have this conversation about how rethinking time can impact engagement and student learning outcomes.
Great. Thank you all so much. Our first question is really going to be getting at the why of this work. Why might we want to rethink time and space in schools? And really, what are the potential impacts and benefits? And Bonnie, I'd actually like to start with you, given that this is an educator competency that GOA has identified. Why should we be rethinking time and space in schools? And then we can kind of hear from others as well.
Thanks, Sarah. I think a potential benefit is student engagement. There is an expectation now, and I think this was probably the case even prior to the pandemic, but certainly over the last couple of years, that learning really does happen anytime and anywhere, and that technology can provide a level of personalization and engagement. But of course, we know that technology is not a substitute. It's a complement. It's most effective when it's a complement to the learning process. And when we use technology effectively, we can scale up quality instruction. We can facilitate personalized instruction and really get to know kids and create that equity and access piece. We can expand opportunities for practice. And we all know from cognitive learning science that practice does lead to learning. And then finally, we can increase learning engagement by making it more personalized, making it ideally fun and a joyful experience to learn.
I can jump in. I kind of see this through two axes. I think the first is that I think everyone's known for years that there's an extraordinary diversity of learning levels and social emotional needs during classrooms. But we sort of continued to use a one-size-fits-all approach that isn't responsive to kids' needs, but instead is sort of like we construct a construct and then expect students to respond to our needs as educators. And that's not a particularly effective way to move kids on a continuum of learning. So I think in many ways, the past few years has kind of exposed that reality that, frankly, I think we've all known, and put some pressure on the system to think differently about instruction. So I think there's the student piece. I'd also just say, I know as a teacher, I always found that teaching was like fundamentally an unconquerable task, right? The idea that you just like walk into a room with all these diverse, awesome minds and somehow you're supposed to like meet all their needs at once was in some ways the coolest thing on the planet, but also impossible to do perfectly. I think one thing I didn't know when I first started teaching, but now feel very confident about, is the most precious resource we have is teacher time. And if we're not thoughtful about designing the learning environment so that teachers are maximizing their time and also maximizing small group and one-on-one instruction, then we're not doing our job as an education system. So I think asking those hard questions now is critical, and it's the right time to start thinking about that. And obviously technology can play a really powerful role when used effectively.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And for me, when listening to you talk, Kareem, I'm thinking about like the things in education we know aren't going to change. And there's not a lot in education we can say isn't likely going to change. But for me, thinking about this path forward, we need to be acknowledging that learner variability is the norm. Like it's not the exception. So as soon as we start to acknowledge and recognize and honor that within the design and facilitation of these learning experiences, it makes a lot of sense to start questioning, why are so many teachers still exclusively using this whole group teacher-led, teacher-paced model? And I know why, right? Ease of planning, there's control features involved in that. But so that variability is something we need to start really honoring in our design work. And then also technology is not going anywhere. I know there's a lot of teachers and a lot of families, quite frankly, after the pandemic who just want to throw computers to the side. And I get it. I'm an advocate for blended learning, and there's a balance between online and offline in that equation. But technology's permeated all these other aspects of our society. And now we even have lots of organizations and workers really grappling with, do I need to be in an office, in a physical space at a certain time to do my job? Or if we think about students to actually learn something. So I think the opportunity around technology is it's not going anywhere, but we get to decide what form, what shape it takes in classrooms. Like, does it free teachers to do what Kareem's saying, which is spend more time tucked alongside individual small groups of learners, supporting their unique kind of path toward whatever these firm goals are?
For sure. And I feel like I've seen that even in friends who are not educators, their careers have changed just dramatically over the past 2 years. And that sort of online learning, this idea that it is a skill to be taught that sort of everyone really needs in order to be prepared for not only sort of what's coming next in terms of academics, but for career and for kind of other pieces that are coming along. Thank you all for starting with that. It'd be great actually also now to dig a little bit deeper into thinking about sort of what have been some of our takeaways from the past 2 years and getting a little bit more concrete. And I'd love to hear from each of you sort of, what do you think that teachers have learned during these pandemic years regarding rethinking time and space that they're going to carry forward? And how might we continue to use online learning in our in-person teaching as well? And Dr. Tucker, if you don't mind, I'd love to start with you because I know you've written quite a bit on this topic.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, I have been a little bit frustrated in I saw the pandemic as kind of this opportunity to really grow a skill set that many teachers didn't necessarily have before the pandemic. And I know that growth was uncomfortable and it was exhausting on a lot of levels, but I think blended learning, online learning, is not like a reaction to a moment. This has been around for a long time. And so we have this opportunity to take the lessons learned, the skills we developed, whether that's facilitating, online discussions, whether that is learning how to create video content and engage kids around it so that they can self-pace through it. There are all of these individual skills that were developed out of necessity because of the pandemic that I wish right now, instead of kind of abandoning and returning to pre-pandemic norms, we were continuing to kind of hone and develop and work on, so that, quite frankly, we could be much more nimble in our approach to teaching, in the students' approach to learning, so that I think often I hear teachers say things that communicate to me, they assume they need a very different skill set and tool set to be successful in a physical space versus an online space. And I actually would love to see educators developing a skill set that's much more nimble, that will allow them to thrive in a physical classroom, an online learning environment, or a blend of the two. So, there just aren't any guarantees in education. There's no guarantee we couldn't get kicked online for some other reason in the future. And what I don't want to see is we have to start from the beginning, kind of relearning this stuff because we just abandoned strategies. We abandoned technology when we return to classrooms, because I just see all of this potential to really start to design with the focus of, let's put the learner at the center of this experience, regardless of the teaching and learning landscape that we're working in.
I could not agree more, Dr. Tucker. And I think that student-centered piece is something that I think is a critical learning that we have to take out of this. When you think about, to some degree, what COVID and some of this online learning and emergency learning did was it exposed, how ineffective and inefficient sort of live, synchronous, sort of direct instruction lecture models are. I think there's something, like, you can convince yourself in a lecture in a classroom that everyone's like into this wild performance and it feels like a movie. But then when you go on Zoom and most of your kids' screens, you can't even see them. And you're kind of wondering, like, what am I speaking into? And is this actually contributing to the learning environment? It's an important question to then ask ourselves, like, wait a minute, is this structure of teaching and learning actually useful, or is it just convenient? I think the second half of this is actually a core equity question. Like, when we think about student-centered instruction, part of the reason that's critical is because kids face diverse challenges that limit their capacity to be able to intake information during a live lecture at a specified time. So when suddenly all these educators, which I think is awesome how innovative they were, put things on learning management systems that are accessible anywhere, anytime, we can't go back. We've actually shown to both students and to families, like, there's no reason we should be restricting access to content for students. And in fact, we should be giving that to folks all the time. And we should be thinking about how we use our time delicately in classrooms for actually driving understanding and then using data to intervene when necessary. So I think COVID sort of exposed what we already knew was the case, but I think it put it kind of on blast and said, hey, like, this whole stand in front of the room, talk at kids is not what's best for kids. It's an awful use of our time as teachers. And it's an awful use of student time as well. And I don't think we can look away from that. So I think right now there's a little bit of like pulling out of the moment. There's a lot of human capital challenges. And I think that's really challenging for leaders and teachers alike. But I do think as hopefully as we move into next school year, there's going to be a pretty big push to say, hey, we can't regress back to traditional practices. And if we do, we're going to find ourselves in the same problem again. But we know that there's some sort of light at the end of the tunnel. And I'm excited about that piece.
And I want to just say your comment about equity is so important to this conversation as well. Because if you think about the fact that just different kids need different inputs to get to a particular output, like, how are we creating or designing lessons, facilitating lessons that allow us to give learners what they need to make progress toward firm goals? And that one size fits all is just never going to accomplish that.
I love this. I don't have a ton more to add because I appreciate so much what our panelists have said. I wanted to point out a couple of comments in the chat. Para Lumen, who's from Punahou, hi, said so many parents and teachers say we need to go back to what we did before, suggesting that we abandon what we learned. And then Megan commenting, like, there is no going back. So I think, yes, the cat is out of the bag now, and we see the potential, and we don't know when or if another emergency is going to come to pass. And so being prepared for online seems super critical. And what we've learned at GOA, we have a faculty that teaches online. They also teach in person at schools. And when they teach online for GOA, our faculty report that the skills they learn from teaching a fully online class, those skills are transferable back to their brick and mortar classes. So if we can prepare for online learning first, we have online hubs. We use them for communication with students and with families, like Dr. Tucker said, then we have a whole skill set we're using already, and we're prepared to teach online. And then we use our precious in-person time effectively.
Thank you all so much for that high level overview. I think is really helpful for us as we're kind of thinking about sort of next steps. And among the questions that we received from registrants for this event, quite a number. I would say the majority of the questions were sort of around this. And I would love for us to start thinking about sort of the how in a little bit more of a concrete way. And so again, we received a number of questions from participants about how to rethink time and space, given that many of us are still operating under traditional schedules, systems, structures. There are only so many steps that maybe as an individual classroom teacher we can take. And so I think what would be helpful to hear right now is, can each of you perhaps speak to 2 to 3 concrete starting points for individual teachers who might be looking to rethink time and space in their classrooms? Again, bearing in mind that they are also operating under sort of a larger system and structure that they might not be able to fully grapple with yet. And anyone feel free to jump in on that one.
I'll jump in because I'm seeing Margaret's question in the chat, which just echoes this, like, right, what does a public school teacher do that's got 35, 37 kids in a class? Like, how do you personalize the kids' experience? How do you give kids what they need? And I think that's what educators are wrestling with. They're like working in a box in a lot of cases, and they don't have the they don't get to decide how long their classes are. So some teachers are teaching on 44-minute periods. Some teachers have 2-hour blocks. And education, if nothing else, is like one make it work moment after another. And so part of why I think I've been so drawn to blended learning is that the models create this structure that can help teachers shift from what many are doing, which is that whole group dynamic, teacher-led, teacher kind of orchestrated. And that's a lot of pressure on the teacher. It's a lot of talking. It's a lot of like monitoring the room, and really starting to lean on these models to think about, as Margaret's saying, like, okay, I have a class of 30 odd kids. I know there are different needs in this class. There's different skills and abilities in this class, different learning preferences in this class. Some kids are going to need pre-teach vocabulary. Some need to build background. So maybe we play around with a small group dynamic using a station rotation, where teachers are going to get to work with a smaller subset of the class to try to target to that particular group of learners' needs. Now, I've worked in classes that are so large, Margaret and everybody else who's listening, where you almost have to divide the room in half and have like mirror station rotations happening simultaneously to keep numbers low and to be able to offer that support at the teacher-led station. Playlists are another great way to do this, where you kind of put together a sequence of learning activities. It can be a single day, multi-week playlist. And in the playlist, students are asked to kind of pause at moments to check in with the teacher for feedback, to personalize the playlist, making additions and kind of changes to the playlist based on formative assessment data and what the kid is saying about their particular progress. So these structures, I feel like, can help to guide a teacher and provide some kind of pathways toward effective differentiation and toward more personalization in the classroom, which is why I get excited about them.
I think those are all fabulous, Dr. Tucker. And the only way that I can provide an answer to this is just describe the model that we support teachers on, which I want to be clear, is an opt-in model. So everyone knows this. So like teachers choose to do this model, and it's not the only one out there. But the one that we, think about at the Modern Classrooms Project is kind of phase one of the strategy is, look, if we're going to keep lecturing and we're going to keep requiring kids to hear live delivery of information to access content, you're losing precious time on the teacher front. And you're also creating a world where you have to have every kid learning the same thing at the same time. So phase one of our model is to say, how do we eliminate lectures? And in our case, we train teachers to build instructional videos or kind of leverage other online resources to have a really effective learning management system. So that's kind of like phase one is, hey, stop relying on the lecture, get away from the front of the room. Phase two is then saying, and this is actually the hardest part about the model, and I want to stress because I see in the chat some folks said it takes time. It absolutely takes time. But I'd say phase two is the most interesting, which is self-paced structures. Like, how do you actually create a classroom where kids are legitimately doing different things at the same time? So in our classrooms, kids are usually self-paced either 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks at a time, no bigger than one unit. Lessons are classified as must do, should do, and aspire to do. So kids are kind of navigating their journey through the learning environment through game boards and structures like that with these guardrails. So kids can be at different spots that they're appropriately challenging and supportive. And then finally, the last piece, and I'd say this is oftentimes a piece that can be forgotten, but actually can drive teacher time effectively, is a mastery check structure. So in our classrooms, teachers build bite-sized mastery checks at the end of each of these lessons. And when you watch one of our teachers teach, you'll notice that they spend the vast majority of their time looking at mastery checks live and then determining who to pull down as a result of what they're seeing on the mastery check. So their small group instruction is driven live in the moment from data they're seeing from kids. Kid turns in, a mastery check and they're not quite getting a skill. Well, come on down and let's do a small group instruction. And they have the time to do that because they're not lecturing, right, and putting on a performance each and every day. So that's one way to think about it. That's the kind of model that we've created at the Modern Classrooms Project. And if you can't tell already, it's a version of a lot of the structures that Dr. Tucker already mentioned, right? And there's a lot of creative ways to think about this.
I love all of this. I'll echo a couple of really concrete places to get started, and just want to shout out Jim in the chat saying it takes time to do this. But if you do already have an online hub, are you using it regularly? And Michael Adams' point about getting families involved. I have a first grader and a fourth grader in public schools, and they were in public schools during the pandemic. And I was often juggling between many different platforms to try to determine what my kids needed to work on. And so if you do have one online space, even though it takes time to set up, yes, it will free you up as the teacher to interact more with students, either individually or in groups, in ways where you can really support each student and their individual needs. And then the second very kind of concrete way to get started would be to identify one learning experience that you could sort of walk through what Kareem talked about with making it a little bit more self-paced. So rather than trying to think you need to take a hammer to your entire curriculum and change everything, which can be really overwhelming, identify one learning experience or unit in which you might be able to employ some of the tactics that our panelists described here.
I just want to dovetail on something Bonnie said, because I know time is the biggest hurdle for all teachers every day, right? There's just not enough hours in the day to get everything done that we're being tasked with. But I think some of the messaging around this really should be, you absolutely have to be much more intentional with your design work. That does take more time. It takes way more time to architect a student-centered learning experience that gives them control over some of these time, place, pace, path kind of elements than it does to roll in and tell kids everything you know about a topic. Yet it's really I think there's a real opportunity there to just allow students to lead the learning. And I think the biggest issue is teachers are like, I don't have time for that design work. And I'm like, but if you're doing what Kareem's saying and you're looking at mastery and you're making time to sit with them and check formative assessment data, give them feedback in the classroom, assess their work with them sitting there so they understand why they're getting the assessment scores they're getting, then those are pieces we're not taking home. So yeah, you're investing more in the front end on the design work, but the back end, you're not taking home, hopefully, stacks of that feedback and grading like you would in a class where you don't get to sit with kids. You don't get to do some of that live. And I think it's so much more powerful when you can sit with kids and conference and give feedback and assess their work with them sitting there so they really understand how they're doing as a learner.
Dr. Tucker, I'm so glad you brought that up because we hear this quite frequently as well, and it's legitimate, right? The planning is more challenging at times, but I kind of liken it to sports. Like if you're a really effective trainer for games, the game is actually fun. The game is enjoyable. You're like competing and loving it. But if you're completely unprepared, the game's terrifying. You're like totally flustered and worried that it's going to be a disaster. When I taught traditionally, every class was terrifying to me, whether I admit it or not, right? Like my heart started racing, the bell rings. I'm like, 4 kids are late. What's going to happen when they come in? Are they going to disrupt the learning environment? And what we're finding in our work is that the teachers who do our model well say that they're less stressed. They feel more optimistic about the future of teaching and learning. These are obvious indicators to say when you reorient your time in the classroom so you actually get to do the things that you wanted to do when you became an educator, it becomes a job that's much more sustainable and one that you really enjoy more. So yes, you may need to put in additional time designing how your course works and how your classroom works, but the benefits of that are enormous. And then at a secondary level, we have found that behavior management is so much better when students are driving the learning experience. And I don't know anything more stressful than behavior management. It's just a reality, right? If you can't get past that, you're going to be panicked the whole time. And when you really shift the learning experience so that students are at the center, I think 2 things happen with behavior management. 1, kids don't constantly feel like they're being put on the spot. They're not like sitting there waiting to be called out, which is never a good feeling and can oftentimes lead to a lot of problems. But 2, when 1 or 2 students are disengaged, it doesn't mean the whole room's disengaged. And I think that, again, going back to equity is really important, but from a behavior management perspective, I think a lot of times teachers live in fear of 1 or 2 students having a bad day and then them not knowing how to kind of deal with that reality and keep the rest of the room moving. And when you put students at the center, when a couple students are disengaged, that's okay. You can actually give them time to re-engage and not worry that the entire room has just like stopped, which obviously is going to escalate the situation as well.
I so appreciate you bringing that up, Kareem. This was a question that for sure also came up. Since you already brought us there, I think it's worth spending a little bit more time kind of going into this piece, but a lot of our registrants had some questions about, in leveraging online and blended learning strategies, how do we support students in staying focused and not distracted by the tech? What are routines or supports that we can kind of put into place to really support our students in kind of taking charge of their learning and time? And, if they're not doing that, like what might some of those interventions look like to support them in kind of learning those skills that they need to monitor their own learning and to kind of get back on track?
Well, and in the environments that we're talking about, they require higher levels of self-regulation skills, right? More developed self-regulation. But kids need to practice those. They need explicit instructions and strategies around how to manage themselves in a physical space. And I think so often, as Kareem was saying, that fear of the handful of kids who are whatever, they're having a day, they're distracted, they're not engaged, which often kind of stems from this misalignment between the pace at which learning is moving and the pace at which they actually need it to learn, which creates kind of frustration and anger and disengagement. But I really think we have so much fear about what could happen that instead of just being like, okay, here's a fear I have around management and behavior. How can I get out in front of this? How can I be proactive? Well, maybe instead of giving kids rules and expectations, I engage this community in a conversation about what we think will keep this a productive, supportive, and positive space. And let's come to agreements that really draw on students' past experience, ask them to engage in conversation, collaboration, to define what is it that we're going to do in this class together. And then once we have that kind of decided on, let's also talk about consequences. I think oftentimes there's behaviors and kids aren't really sure what the consequence is going to be. And quite frankly, it might be a lesser consequence on a day when a teacher feels rested and not spread thin, instead of just saying, here's what you can expect, right? We've agreed on these things. If there's a misstep, this is kind of how we're going to handle it. There might be a verbal kind of redirection. There might be, a physical movement to kind of let a student work on their own in a particular scenario. And then maybe it becomes, you need to communicate with your parent about what's happening in this classroom. So demystifying and making consequences transparent and a conversation among, again, this is a learning community. we should probably be having these conversations together. And then I think, one of the things that was so fascinating in my own research was that blended teachers teaching blended learning courses or courses with a blended format versus traditional courses felt that they had stronger relationships with the learners in their blended courses because they had time to connect with them and support them. And because of that, there were fewer issues as well. So it's really about prioritizing that relationship building and maintenance as well, not just through like community building activities, but through our actual interactions and the ways in which we handle things like grading, feedback, late work. Like, do kids feel they can have conversations and trust us? Do they feel they can take risks in this physical space? So it's a puzzle for sure, but I think so often we don't engage learners in the conversation at all.
And I'll add, we see similar trends. And one of the things that I often feel like is a misfire is we need to focus less on engagement and more on re-engagement. Because I think there's some sort of obsession when you walk into a classroom, like this weird exercise, like let's like tally how many kids are engaged and how many are disengaged. I mean, before this call, I was on TikTok. I don't think I was supposed to be on TikTok at 1 p.m. during my workday, but I just disengaged for a bit and watched some funny videos and then came back to work. In a classroom setting, I might have gotten reprimanded for that, which is kind of wild when you think about how often we as adults disengage and re-engage. We do this constantly. If you walk into any faculty meeting, you will see it. Any meeting anywhere, you will see it. But then for some reason, when you walk into a classroom, quite frequently, the question is, are any kids disengaged? And if they are disengaged, what are you going to do about it? And I think that's sort of a weird proposition and not the right way to approach it. When we find really high quality kind of structures and systems in place in classrooms, it's all about assessing whether a kid has spent too long disengaged and then having a conversation with them about what that then means for their progress in the course. So instead of saying, get off your phone, having a discussion around, hey, just an FYI, you've been on your phone for like 5 minutes. The class isn't that long and you got to accomplish these tasks. Like, what's your game plan? So kids can start to really internalize instead the core idea that you engage for a purpose. It's okay to disengage, but if you don't re-engage quickly, it has consequences on your capacity to stay afloat in this class, and that's not what you want. I think we as adults kind of understand that and expect that, but then we should apply that same treatment to students. And right now we don't, right? A lot of times we walk into classrooms and think differently. And I know there's a lot of leaders on this call. I think it's a really important piece to discuss as leaders too, around what you expect from teachers. Because a lot of times teachers do those quick reprimands because they're worried that if someone walks in their class and a kid puts a headphone in or turns on Instagram, someone's going to be like, kid was on Instagram for all of 3 seconds and no consequence was delivered. I don't think that's where we should be prioritizing our energy. We should be prioritizing our energy around how fast can kids re-engage and are they actually mastering content?
Well, and maybe if teachers weren't like, I think part of the reason they react so strongly to those moments, and I would imagine you probably see this or hear that, is like, if they're standing in the front of the room and they're saying something they're not going to say again, the kids aren't going to access somewhere else. And it's like, whoa, put your phone down. You got to listen. You got to get this or you're going to miss it. And in these more student-centered, student-paced environments using these different structures, then yeah, I remember in my classroom, I didn't do it as much with technology, but because they would like put their phone sometimes at an offline station and like a hanger, so they weren't a distraction. But like we had like adult coloring book pages photocopied. We had like Sudoku and word puzzles. It's like if you just need a break, just like a 5-10 minute brain break, like you should be able to do that. And I have the same experience in training where teachers will literally look up from texting on their phone and be like, but what do we do about all these devices that are distracting kids? And I'm like, okay, they're part of our lives. Like, let's figure out how to not make it this bone of contention every time a kid touches a device when, they're not supposed to.
I love all of this. Yet Sarah and I yesterday were talking about how as adults, we sometimes like to watch YouTube, right? And listen to some music even while we're working. And I do think there's that metacognitive or self-reflection process, asking students like, what does help you focus, especially if you're during independent work time. Maybe it is actually listening to music while you're working, and that's actually completely fine. But what are the processes through which teachers are asking students to self-reflect on what does keep them on track versus what might be a distraction?
It's so funny because, we just sort of talked a little bit about the time that it takes to kind of like set up some of these structures around self-pacing, around blended learning, and even here in this conversation around relationships and supporting students, like there is that tension again between what's the quick fix going to be versus sort of the long enduring strategy, right? It's quicker to just say put your phone away than it is to kind of pause and have a conversation and interrupt what's going on. But ultimately, what seems to be coming out of this conversation is that we have to start playing the long game, so to speak, with some of the practices that we're engaging with, and really thinking about kind of, again, the quick fixes are great, but what is going to be the ultimate impact on our students? I wanna kind of jump back a little bit, because this was a question that came up from quite a few teachers as well, who really love the idea of, again, of using blended learning, of using self-paced learning, leveraging online strategies. But a lot of questions came up really around this idea of collaboration and what does that look like? Like, what does it look like to have a collective experience when you have students who are moving along at different paces? And if we're thinking about classroom community, what does that look like when we're rethinking time and space? So it'd be great to kind of hear some thoughts about how we kind of navigate that aspect of rethinking time and space.
I love this question, primarily because sometimes when that pushback comes on self-paced learning, I chuckle a bit because I think everyone needs to be reminded that everyone's at a different spot, whether you like it or not. I think there's some sort of belief that when you teach traditionally, and just because you're teaching lesson 4 today, everyone's actually ready for lesson 4, but that's nonsense, right? We know that that's not the case. So you don't need to be on the exact same skill to collaborate is the first thing I'd say. If you look at an effective workplace, everyone's not working on the exact same skill, but they're collaborating. So I like to think of collaboration in 2 ways. I think there's planned collaboration, which is like, hey, we're about to have a discussion. There's a reason we're discussing this. We come together. There's a rationale for it. That's why we're collaborating. That might be whole group or in small groups. But then I think about this idea of organic collaboration, which is really cultivating in students the mindset that your peers are an asset. And that if you're all trying to accomplish a similar goal, we should lean on our peers to be able to help us get there. And I don't see that as turn and talk, right? Turn and talk says, I just like factored a quadratic. Now turn and talk to your friend about the quadratic. For me as a student, when I was told to do that, I was like, well, collaboration is not very purposeful because I have nothing to talk about over here. And like I factored the quadratic or I didn't, and I'm going to wait for you to tell me how. But when we start to say, hey, you're struggling on lesson 3, well, there's 4 kids over there who actually mastered lesson 3, and there's 2 kids over here who are currently working on it. You should leverage their expertise and give them some of the structures to kind of ask the right questions. That's how you start to get students to understand that you don't go straight to your boss when you have a question. You actually go to your colleagues when you have a question. And that's the best way to arrive at a common answer. So I see them as 2 parts, but I think the core misunderstanding is to kind of trick ourselves into thinking that just because I'm teaching lesson 5 today, everyone's ready for lesson 5. FYI, that's not the case.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And I love the distinction between different kinds of collaboration. Often it happens a lot, say in like a playlist model training where I'm helping teachers backward design a playlist. And they're like, but they're just going to be staring at their screen the whole time, working on their own. And I'm such an advocate for balance, like balancing online, offline, individual, collaborative tasks. And so I'm like, no, you build offline tasks into the playlist. You build opportunities to collaborate in the playlist. But then I think the question becomes, how do we operationalize that? Like, what does that look like in a classroom? And so to give like an example, I was working in a 3rd grade classroom and students were working through this playlist. It was a science-based playlist about animals, animal habitats, and they were connected with a learning, like a team. And their team was for that informal collaboration. Like you get stuck, here's your team, ask questions, like bounce bounce ideas around. And then they also had, basically the teacher had a Padlet wall using the grid format with like different sections of the playlist. So if a student needed help, or a student was at a place where they were supposed to be engaging in a discussion, or basically swapping work samples to kind of talk about them and give each other feedback, then it was like they posted that they were ready, and that's where they were on the Padlet, so they could like find each other in the classroom for these interactive pieces, for the more organized or structured collaboration built into the playlist. So it's more just about thinking through those workflows and how to make sure students know who they can kind of lean on if they get stuck, if they need help, really tapping into the collective intelligence that's in this physical space with them, but then also to kind of identify without, having to like yell out or make a big announcement, like, here's where I am. And this is, I'm ready to meet with somebody who's in the same place on this playlist. And it works beautifully. And I think so often the fear of, oh, it's not going to work ends up being the barrier to even trying some of this stuff.
I love this question because at GOA, we have a lot of our GOA faculty on this call right now. So it's just a massive shout out to everyone that teaches for GOA, because our student program courses do allow for whole group discussion, but it's often across time zones. So you aren't necessarily having that happen synchronously, and you can do class discussions in an asynchronous format using Padlet or Jamboard. And in some ways, integrating asynchronous discussions can broaden our notion of what it looks like to participate. And it gives students more time to think through sort of thoughtful responses. And for those that maybe are more introverted or prefer to type or write out how they want to interact in a class discussion, it actually creates more access. So it's a tool in the toolkit for teachers, for sure. Don't overlook that idea of asynchronous discussions and whole group conversations.
Well, and I just want to say, because you made a comment, Bonnie, earlier that I loved about like, hey, we have planned for the online, and then we have it as a resource, even when we're teaching face-to-face. And one of the things that I do in my own classes with students who are teacher candidates is when we get to a discussion in our physical classes together, I even now started saying, because I know there are barriers to discussion when it's real-time rapid fire, when it's online. So I will literally post the discussion questions to our LMS and then say, hey, if you want to just take some time, think about the question, articulate a response in writing, you can do that in this more asynchronous mode. If you really love sitting in a circle with a smaller group of learners in this class and having a real-time conversation, go to one of these two corners of the room and do that. And so, we even have this possibility of kind of thinking bigger about student agency and choice and removing some of those barriers by kind of leaning on those different ways to approach something like discussion.
And so one of the questions that came up in our chat is, what about for sort of younger students? So like K to 3 or elementary students, are they, can this work for some of our younger students as well? And if so, are there modifications, or what are those modifications to kind of support them in doing this kind of work?
That's my second favorite question, because so I was a high school teacher when we built the Modern Classrooms project model, and there was an Edutopia video made about it, and everyone thought it was a secondary approach. And I was like, look, I just taught high school, and I probably would have been an awful kindergarten teacher because I think kindergarten teachers are magnificent, and I don't know how to be a kindergarten teacher. But everyone assumed that just because it's student-centered or requires self-regulation, that suddenly it's for older kids. And I actually think that is the exact opposite. In fact, I think we hammer out of students this notion that you can be at the center of a learning experience. And any parent on here has watched their own child learn how to stack blocks. I don't think it was like a super structured lecture format. I don't think like you went on a whiteboard and showed them how to stack blocks and then they replicate it. It was a student-centered environment, right? Kids understand how to be student-centered. So we have some unbelievable teachers at the kindergarten and pre-K level. I think the main difference is, yeah, you probably got to set some clearer guardrails, right? You can't be like, hey, learn this whole unit on, counting on your own. So you might do shorter bursts of self-pacing, or you might have shorter instructional videos, or you might create much clearer structures around how stations operate. But the notion that a younger student can't be at the center of the learning experience is categorically false. And I would argue actually that it can be much harder to transform a secondary classroom because they're very used to that. In fact, I can tell you that from my own personal experience. I can tell you that some of my 12th graders were so furious that I was not spoon feeding content at the front of the room. We would have arguments after school about why I can't just give them credit for the assignment, keep it moving. And what's the deal with this mastery check? And why do I have to watch my own videos? Just tell it to me. So I think it's just a really interesting, categorically false assumption that's been created. So anyone who's teaching younger students or supporting schools that teach younger students, I promise you they can be self-directed. They're actually, frankly, better at it than I am.
No, I absolutely echo that. I hear all the time from secondary teachers like, no, high school students can't do that. And I'm like, I just watched this happen in a first grade classroom. They can absolutely do it. But I do think that these older students, they've been trained, right? They've been trained to kind of perceive their role in classrooms is like, I sit here, I'm generally quiet, I stare in your direction and like, check, I've done my job. And I'm like, no, we have to expect so much more from learners. We need the learners to be our partners in this work. They need to be doing the heavy cognitive lifting. They need to be thinking, reflecting, stretching those metacognitive muscles. All of that's so important. But I almost feel like there is this reteaching that needs to happen in these older grades to help students understand some of the value of that. But I think younger kids, yeah, there may need to be more explicit kind of teaching of skills and modeling and the guardrails and all of that, but they're so incredibly creative and capable. I've seen all of these different models work, and the beauty of technology, quite frankly, as it's evolving, things like Flipgrid and Seesaw, they're making it easy even for young learners to record statements and participate in a video-based instruction if their keyboard skills really aren't there yet. So it's kind of removing those barriers for them as well, which is really exciting.
I have to ask this question. As a former high school English teacher, the homework question was always a big one, even before COVID, in terms of what do we do with this concept? And so in kind of thinking about rethinking time and space in schools, what role does homework play? How do we need to look at that if we are trying to think about creating more student-centered experiences? And I open that question up to anyone to take on.
Start us off and just say it comes down to purpose. What transferable skills are you looking for students to learn in your class, and be clear about the why of homework? And then the other piece is, I mean, there's so much of this that we haven't really touched on. We could go on and on, but there's a wellness component around the homework issue, and just ensuring that students aren't overwhelmed and have downtime and time with family and time with friends. And so as a school, just and as a teaching team, being really clear and intentional about the purpose of homework and not trying to cram content, instead focusing on transferable skill development that can really help students feel prepared for college and career.
And not just a wellness, it's also an equity issue. We're making a lot of assumptions about home environments and levels of support when we send massive amounts of work home with kids. So like Bonnie, I have 2 children, and I see the amount of time they spend on homework. And quite frankly, the longer I'm in education, the less and less of a fan I am of homework. Kids need a break. They've been in school for 6 to 7 hours. I wish anything they pursued learning wise outside of school was like passion and self-driven. And then, yeah, like we can't assume students have a quiet space. They have a support structure at home to help them with homework. And so I have some real concerns around the equity piece of homework as well.
I do as well, and I certainly experienced that as an educator. The last thing I'll add is I again would liken it to the workplace. Like, we don't have homework in the workplace when we get our job done during work time. So there's an odd assumption in K-12 ed that even if you've done everything you were supposed to do in the workplace, you still got other stuff to do at home. So I know at the Modern Classrooms Project, a lot of our educators take the perspective that you only have work to do at home if you've fallen behind on what you should have done in class. And yeah, that happens quite frequently. But again, I think we want to reinforce the right sets of structures and incentives. You have to do stuff at home when you didn't accomplish what you said you would accomplish during class or in the workplace. So yeah, I think, different teachers can leverage homework in different ways. And sometimes you're preparing for high stakes, things like APs. Like, I'm not going to speak on behalf that like everyone shouldn't offer homework, But I will say that I think we want to be really thoughtful about not just making it that extra thing that everyone does because it's cool to give homework. It's not particularly cool to give homework. Students don't like it. And it's not actually aligned to what we would expect amongst our colleagues, right? That you have to take work home all of the time. That's actually counter to what we would expect from adults.
Yeah, I think the phrasing I used to use, Kareem, was like, if you don't finish these, the things that were deliverables, then they kind of follow you home. But it was never like, here's your separate assignment that I whipped up for homework.
Totally. When kids would come to me, they'd be like, so do I have homework? And I'd be like, I don't know. Where are you at in the learning experience, right? You tell me, and then like, I'm 2 lessons behind. Well, I was like, sounds like you might want to go home and do some stuff. So I totally agree.
I honestly could talk to the three of you all day about that. I have so many follow-up questions. I have several quotes from each of you that I am going to be thinking about, I think, throughout the day today and probably later on.